May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended in silence, rather than thunder. Dawn lifted slowly across the ruined landscapes of Bavaria, its gray light falling over muddy fields and abandoned farmhouses. Along one narrow road, a column of weary figures moved without the sound of boots striking pavement, only the slush of shoes through wet earth. They were not soldiers in the way the world had come to picture them. No rifles slung across shoulders, no iron helmets gleaming, but young women in threadbare uniforms, skirts muddied to the knee, armbands marked with fading insignia. Most were barely in their 20s. Some had worked switchboards. Others had kept the ledgers of vanished regiments. A few had once manned anti-aircraft posts until their batteries ran out of shells. Now all marched as captives of fate, waiting for whatever justice the victors would deal. Fear kept their posture stiff, even as exhaustion bent their spines. For years they had been told what to expect, that Americans were wild, crude, merciless men who would treat them as spoils. They had repeated those stories in the barracks, half believing, half hoping not to. But as the Reich collapsed around them, propaganda blurred into something darker. If the bombs had crushed their cities and burned their neighbors alive, what restraint would the men who dropped them show to the women of the enemy? Their minds carried that question heavier than any satchel. Among them walked a girl named Liesel, just 21, once a typist for an artillery regiment stationed outside Munich. Her fingers, which had flown across typewriter keys at a speed that earned her scolding glances from slower clerks, now gripped the hem of her skirt. Beside her trudged Marta, older by 3 years, who had been assigned as a telephone operator in a command bunker that no longer existed. Marta's voice had once carried coded messages of troop movements. Now she spoke nothing, saving her words as if silence could keep her safe. A few steps behind, fragile Anna, scarcely 19, coughed into her sleeve, the result of weeks spent without proper food or shelter. None looked like villains. All looked like children forced into uniforms by history's cruelty. Ahead, at the bend in the road, they caught their first glimpse of American helmets, olive drab against the pale sky, rifles cradled but not raised. A handful of soldiers waited. The women froze. A flock of crows rose from a field, filling the silence with harsh cries. And for a moment, the women thought they were the only sound they would ever hear again. Liesel's lips trembled. Marta whispered a prayer. Anna closed her eyes. The column moved forward under the barked order of a German sergeant, still clutching dignity like a drowning man holds driftwood. The distance narrowed. The Americans' faces became clearer. Young, sunburned, some needing shaves, some chewing gum. And then, instead of the shouted curses or blows the women expected, one of the soldiers, barely older than Liesel, did something disorienting. He smiled. It was not broad nor mocking, but a brief polite curve of the lips, as if greeting a neighbor on a morning street. The effect was so startling that several women looked away, ashamed of their own relief. One soldier raised a hand not to strike but to gesture them closer. Another tipped his helmet, a gesture absurdly gallant for the setting. It was as though the world had tilted, and the roles they had imagined shattered like glass. When the column reached the checkpoint, the sergeant barked that they were auxiliaries, not combatants. The Americans listened, nodding, noting details in notebooks. Their English words were brisk, efficient, yet absent of cruelty. Then came the second shock. A private approached carrying a box. From it he pulled wrapped rectangles, chocolate, the kind that had vanished from German shelves years before. He handed them out with the same motion he might have used at home to pass candy to a cousin. Anna, frail and shivering, stared at the bar in her hands as if it were contraband from another planet. Her lips parted, but no words came. She bit into it, and tears ran down her cheeks, not for sweetness alone, but for the confusion of receiving kindness from the men she had been told were beasts. The Americans did not invite conversation, but their restraint spoke loudly. They offered bread and coffee. The smell of roasted beans drifted across the roadside like a taunt to hunger. For months the women had survived on watery cabbage or crusts harder than stone. The steam rising from the tin mugs seemed more unreal than the rubble of their cities. Marta accepted hers carefully, her hands trembling so hard she spilled a few drops. She whispered, "Danke," not sure the men understood. The private nodded as if he did. All the while, discipline hung over the American camp like a rule carved in stone. No lewd words, no reaching hands, no displays of power beyond the rifles slung across their backs. Eisenhower had ordered that POWs, even auxiliaries, were to be treated with dignity under the Geneva Convention. That law, abstract in books and treaties, now took the shape of young men checking lists and handing out rations. It seemed impossible. Yet here it was, unfolding on a muddy road on the day the war was officially declared over. For the women, the shift was almost unbearable. The enemy who had been painted as a monster was instead courteous, almost indifferent in his kindness. The propaganda posters of snarling American beasts were replaced by the sight of a soldier, carefully adjusting the strap of his rifle so as not to look threatening. The silence between captor and captive became heavier than violence would have been. It forced the women to reckon with the possibility that much of what they had believed was untrue. Lysel, clutching her ration of bread, stared at the soldier's smile and felt something fracture inside her. For years she had copied dictations praising the fatherland, typing speeches about defending German honor to the last breath. Now honor tasted like stale bread softened by hot broth given by a stranger in foreign uniform. She thought of her father dead in Stalingrad and wondered what he would think if he saw her being fed by an American. Would he be ashamed or would he be relieved that at least someone had spared his daughter? As dusk approached, the women were herded toward a truck bound for an internment camp. The Americans gave brief instructions, pointing to the vehicle, ensuring order without threats. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and wet earth, but also of coffee and chocolate still melting on tongues. The women climbed aboard, their minds spinning with contradictions. Marta leaned toward Lysel and whispered, "If this is captivity, then what was freedom?" Lysel had no answer. She only tightened her grip on the ration she dared not finish, as if proof of kindness might vanish if she ate it all. The truck rattled forward, its wheels kicking up mud, carrying them away from the road where their old world had ended. Behind them, the American soldiers stood watch, rifles slung, faces calm. Anna looked back once and caught another fleeting smile from the private, who had given her chocolate. It was not triumph, not pity, just a small human acknowledgement. That glimpse unsettled her more than cruelty ever could, for in that moment the true battle began, not one of armies or guns, but of memory and belief. These women had been raised to fear monsters. Instead, they found men who offered food, warmth, and discipline. And as the truck jolted into the distance, they carried not scars of violence, but the disarming weight of kindness. Yet what that kindness meant, and how it would shape their understanding of everything they had once believed, was a question that would haunt them far longer than the war itself. Questioned her, a man in his 30s with sharp eyes, asked simple thing, where she had worked, what documents she had typed, whether she had seen troop movements. His tone was steady, not harsh, and when she struggled for words, he waited. At the end, instead of threats, he offered her water. She drank with shaking hands, unable to believe interrogation could taste of mercy. Returning to the barracks, she told the others, "He treated me as if I were human." The silence that followed was more powerful than any shout. The women began to compare notes, each story contradicting what they had believed. Marcia spoke of overhearing two guards joking about baseball, a game she could not understand but recognized as harmless. Anna described how one soldier had bent down to retrieve her dropped spoon, handing it back with a nod. These were not grand gestures, but their very ordinariness dismantled years of propaganda. The women had been told to expect brutality, humiliation, and yet they received courtesy. That courtesy was harder to endure than cruelty, because cruelty would have confirmed their fears. Courtesy forced them to re-examine everything. At night, conversations circled endlessly. Was this real? Would it last? Lysel argued that perhaps it was only temporary, a mask hiding true intentions. Marcia countered that no mask could last so long without slipping. Anna confessed that she no longer knew what to believe, and her confession was met with nods of weary agreement. Each day brought not answers, but deeper questions, and in those questions lay the torment of captivity, and still life pressed forward. Meals continued. Roll calls passed without incident. The guards' politeness did not falter. Slowly the women felt their bodies healing, but their hearts twisted in uncertainty. Marta, gazing through the wire at the horizon one evening, murmured, "We are prisoners. Yet I feel freer here than I did in the Reich." Lysel turned sharply, whispering, "Don't say that." But in her chest, she felt the truth of it burning. Then came the small moment that would lodge in their memory forever. One afternoon, as the women were escorted across the compound. They heard music drifting from a radio in the guards' quarters. The tune was swing, bright and playful, utterly foreign to their ears after years of marching songs and anthems. The guards tapped their feet, grinning at the rhythm, and for a fleeting instant, the women felt the world open wider than their prison fences. It was not the sound of conquerors mocking the defeated. It was simply life, alive and unbroken, spilling into their captivity. Anna laughed, a short, startled sound, and covered her mouth as if laughter were forbidden. The guards turned surprised but said nothing. That night, lying in bunks, the women whispered about the music. Marcia admitted she could not stop humming the tune, though she did not know the words. Lysel confessed that the melody made her chest ache with something she could not name. Anna whispered, "If monsters make music like that, then maybe monsters don't exist." The others fell silent, unsettled by her words, for they hinted at a truth none dared admit aloud. Their world was turning upside down. The next morning, the routine resumed as if nothing had changed. Yet within the women, something had shifted. Kindness was no longer an anomaly. It was a pattern, undeniable and persistent. And with each smile, each meal, each unexpected gesture, the conflict deepened, not between guards and prisoners, but within the prisoners themselves. They were no longer sure who their enemies were or what it meant to be captive. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the compound, Lysel stood at the fence, watching an American guard adjust his helmet with absent-minded ease. She felt her heart twist, caught between hatred she had been taught and gratitude she could not suppress. Behind her, Marcia whispered, "If they are not what we feared, then what does that make us?" The question lingered in the cool evening air, heavier than barbed wire, sharper than rifles, waiting for an answer. None of them yet dared to speak. The morning sun spilled gold across the camp, glinting off the barbed wire, and throwing long shadows of the watchtowers across the gravel. By now the routines were familiar: roll call, breakfast, work details. But what unsettled the women most was not the monotony. It was the absence of everything they had been taught to expect. No fist slammed into ribs. No jeering laughter followed their steps. Instead, there was structure, courtesy, and a rhythm of life that felt more stable than anything left in the ruins of Germany. For Lysel, Marcia, and Anna, every passing day pressed them further into a contradiction that gnawed at the edges of their beliefs. The Reich had promised them monsters. Reality gave them men with polite nods and coffee steaming in tin mugs. One afternoon, while scrubbing laundry in basins near the barracks, the women overheard a pair of guards talking in low voices. Their words were foreign, but the tone was unmistakable. Easy laughter, jokes shared in the sunshine. Then came something more shocking. One guard, grinning, reached into his pocket and pulled out a stick of chewing gum. He offered it to Marta, who froze, soap dripping from her hands. Suspicion warred with curiosity, but the guard's expression held no mockery, only casual generosity. With trembling fingers, she accepted. The texture was strange, the sweetness startling. She chewed slowly, cautiously, until the absurdity of it cracked something inside her. All her life she had been told Americans would spit on her. Instead, one had given her candy. She laughed aloud, a raw, startled sound that made the other women glance up. The propaganda posters flashed in her mind, grim caricatures of leering GIs, grotesque and dangerous. Yet here, in flesh and blood, stood a man who had offered her sugar instead of a slap. The poster seemed suddenly childish, like nightmares drawn by a frightened child. Marta's laugh turned into a sob, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, horrified by the emotions colliding within her. The guard, not understanding, simply shrugged and went on humming a tune. Anna, still fragile, though stronger now, studied every gesture of the soldiers with wide, searching eyes. She remembered the speeches broadcast over crackling radios. Americans were decadent, immoral, brutal. But when she dropped her blanket in the mud one evening, it was an American guard who bent to pick it up, brushing it off before handing it back. The kindness was so small, so ordinary, that it struck her harder than any speech. She carried the blanket back into the barracks, clutching it to her chest, whispering, "They lied to us." The others heard her, but no one corrected her. The collapse of certainty spread like cracks through glass. Lysel fought hardest against it. She repeated the words of her father, a man who had died believing in duty, who had told her never to trust an enemy's smile. She clung to that warning like armor. Yet every day the armor grew heavier. When she was summoned again for questioning, She braced for cruelty. Instead, the officer offered her a chair, listened patiently, and concluded with a simple thank you. That phrase, ordinary, respectful, lodged itself in her chest. She walked back to the barracks, shaken, feeling as though she had betrayed her father by surviving a kindness. The women whispered at night, their voices weaving into the darkness. Marta admitted she could not reconcile the enemy she had been taught to fear with the one she now faced. Anna confessed she dreamed of the music she had heard on the guards' radio, music full of laughter instead of rage. Liesl tried to silence them, insisting it was all a strategy, a performance to break their will. But even as she spoke, doubt coiled in her gut. Could such casual humanity truly be staged? The evidence mounted. The Red Cross arrived for inspections, their officials, walking through the camp with notebooks and calm authority. They spoke to the women, ensuring they were fed, clothed, and housed properly. The presence of international witnesses shattered the last expectation of secret brutality. If cruelty was to happen, surely it would not be paraded before outsiders. Instead, the women realized the Americans wanted the world to see their discipline. That thought unsettled them in ways starvation never could. For Marta, the turning point came with illness. She developed a fever, her body shivering in the night. Terrified she would be left to die, she prepared herself for neglect. But a guard noticed her weakness during roll call and summoned a medic. Within hours, she was given aspirin, a clean blanket, and rest in a warmer barrack. She recovered within days, stunned not just by the medicine, but by the simple fact that an enemy had chosen to save her. Lying awake afterward, she whispered into the dark, "If this is war, then what was peace?" The irony of their situation was not lost on them. Letters from home still described hunger, fear, and chaos. Their families dug through rubble for scraps while the prisoners, were fed bacon and bread. Anna read one letter aloud, her voice trembling as her mother described neighbors collapsing in the streets from malnutrition. The barracks fell silent as the women stared at their trays, guilt cutting deeper than gratitude. Captivity had become not punishment but reprieve, and that realization cut against everything they had been told to expect. The other women saw it, and in that fragile smile lay the acknowledgement of a truth none could ignore any longer. Yet acceptance brought no comfort. If the enemy was not the monster, then what had they been fighting for? If kindness came from the hands they had been told would destroy them, then what did that say about those who had demanded their loyalty? The questions deepened, echoing louder than any sermon, and the answers threatened to undo the very core of who they were. As the barracks settled into silence that night, Liesl stared at the ceiling, fists clenched, whispering to herself the words of her father. But they no longer sounded like truth. They sounded like echoes, and just before sleep claimed her, she admitted what terrified her most. The enemy was teaching her how to hope again. The summer air grew warmer as weeks turned into months, and with the change in season came a change inside the women themselves. The fences still loomed, the watchtowers still stood, but the weight of fear no longer pressed as heavily. Instead, something stranger had taken its place. Gratitude tangled with shame, comfort laced with guilt. They had entered the camp believing they would be broken. Instead, they found themselves mended in ways they could not have predicted. Each day brought reminders that the war was over, yet its ghosts lingered in letters from home. Liesl received word that her mother had bartered her last family heirloom for flour, while Marta's cousin described entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Anna's village wrote of sickness spreading through children who had not seen milk in months. Reading these words by the dim barracks light, the women realized the cruel irony. They, the prisoners, were better fed, cleaner, and safer than the loved ones they longed to return to. The guilt of that truth pressed on their chests like a stone they could not dislodge. And yet in the camp, life offered unexpected dignity. Guards tipped their helmets as the women passed. Meals remained steady, sometimes even generous, with fruit or jam added to trays. When Anna's cough worsened again, a medic listened to her chest, prescribing rest and hot broth. She recovered within days, whispering afterward that she felt guilty for surviving more comfortably in captivity than her neighbors did in freedom. Liesl snapped at her, "Don't say that," but her voice cracked with the strain of holding together a world that no longer made sense. Small acts began to stitch into memory more tightly than orders or lectures ever had. One afternoon, a guard set a photograph near the mess hall. filling the camp with swing music. The women gathered near the barracks windows, listening as the jaunty rhythms carried across gravel and barbed wire. Marta hummed along without meaning to, tapping her fingers against her thigh. She had not realized how much silence had dominated her ears until music cracked it open. "It sounds like laughter," Anna said softly, and the others nodded, though none wanted to admit how deeply it unsettled them to find joy echoing from the enemy's machine. The propaganda that had once been their armor now felt like rags. They had been told the Americans would strip them of dignity. Instead, dignity was returned in small doses. A blanket tucked properly, a name spoken without malice, a wave offered in the rain. Those gestures were not grand, but they were corrosive to lies. The women no longer feared beatings. Instead, they feared the hollow space left behind when their certainty dissolved. If the enemy could be kind, what did that say about those who had demanded blind loyalty at home? The turning point came in late July when a group of the women were taken to work in nearby fields under American supervision. The day was hot, the sky blazing blue, and the soil rich with crops that had not been bombed into dust. They bent to their tasks, hands in earth, when a farmer approached with baskets of apples. He handed them out with a smile, his children peeking shyly from behind him. The women froze, stunned at being treated not as criminals, but as workers worthy of refreshment. Marta bit into her apple, juice running down her chin, and closed her eyes against the sweetness. In that bite, she tasted not only fruit, but the collapse of years of indoctrination. That night, lying in her bunk, Marta whispered, "If this is defeat, perhaps it is gentler than victory." Liesl wanted to argue, but the words faltered on her lips. She had carried her father's warnings like commandments, but each day they felt more like shadows dissolving in light. The enemy had become less terrifying than the silence of her own thoughts. Anna murmured, "Maybe kindness is stronger than fear." And for once, neither of the others corrected her. By autumn, release was whispered of. Some prisoners were already being sent home. The prospect filled the women with both hope and dread. They longed to return, yet feared the ruins awaiting them. More than that, they wondered how to explain what they had seen. How could they tell families still starving in cellars that the Americans had given them bacon and blankets? How could they speak of politeness when others remembered only firestorms? To carry home the truth was to risk disbelief, even scorn, and yet truth clung to them like a second skin they could not shed. On the morning of their transfer, the women were assembled near the gate. Their belongings were few: blankets folded, letters tucked into pockets, bars of soap kept like relics. The guards stood ready, some smiling faintly in farewell. One soldier, the same who had once offered Anna chocolate, tipped his helmet again, a gesture so simple yet so heavy with meaning. Anna met his eyes, her face calm, and for the first time she did not look away. She whispered, "Danke," knowing he likely understood. The sound of her gratitude was quiet, but it carried like thunder in her companions' hearts. As the truck pulled away, rattling over gravel, the women looked back. The camp receded, the barbed wire thinning into distance, but the memory of it would never leave. They had come expecting brutality. They departed with the weight of kindness, a burden more disorienting than chains. In the silence of that ride, each carried a question she could not yet answer. If the enemy could be gentle, then what was the true measure of all they had sacrificed? For years afterward, many of them would recall those weeks not as humiliation, but as the first time they glimpsed another way of living, discipline without cruelty, power without hatred. Some would write of it in journals. Others would speak of it to children who could not imagine the fear that once consumed them. And though they returned to a broken Germany, they carried within them the witness of something greater than propaganda, the simple truth that humanity had outlived the war. Yet even as the truck rolled closer to home, a new conflict began. To survive kindness was one thing. To live with its memory in a land still poisoned by bitterness was another. The women sat together, shoulders touching, eyes fixed on the horizon. Behind them the camp faded. Ahead lay ruins and hunger. And between those two worlds they carried a fragile flame of belief that perhaps, against all odds, gentleness could endure.